Good morning. Today is the first mini lesson that's going to tie directly into our learning targets. So for this mini lesson, we're focusing in on the essential question of what makes narrative writing different from other types. And number 4, what kind of organization can be used in this form of writing? We're going to look in our learning target packet at the page for organizational learning targets. So please date organization learning target number 1, today's date, which is 8/23. So for this lesson and for this learning target, it reads to use a plot diagram to organize your narrative in logical and chronological sequential order. So a narrative tells a story. So it has to have a plot. In order to have a plot, we are referring to that it has the items of an exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. These areas of our story need to be in a logical or chronological order. Chronological order means it needs to have a beginning, middle, and an end. So we don't tell the story from the beginning and then jump to the end and then go back to the middle. Chronological order means it goes from the beginning to the middle to the end, following this format. Now, most likely, you're going to go through a lot of detail about how to tell your story using this plot diagram. And with this plot diagram, although my triangle seems fairly even, usually a lot of the areas that we focus in on in a short story are this part, and it's very short from this part to the end. So the exposition includes your characters, setting, and conflict. So that's where we introduce all of those aspects. Your rising action is the building of that conflict. The climax is where the conflict reaches its peak. Your falling action is where the conflict starts to kind of fizzle out. And the resolution is where the conflict is completely gone. So as a writer, it's important that we have all of these elements we learn about in reading class in our writing. In order to do that, sometimes it's best to look at how another author does it. So in your writing, the best way to start, in my opinion, outlining for a story that you are writing, a narrative you are writing, is by creating this triangle directly in your notebooks and filling in the pieces. Obviously, you'll add more detail and more examples and all of those things as you go through. But it's better to fill in the pieces as you go at the beginning so that as you go, you make sure the story is told in a proper chronological order, beginning, middle, and end. For instance, say I decide to do a story about my cat, Bootsy. A narrative can be fiction or nonfiction. This one is a combination of fiction and nonfiction. I do have a cat named Bootsy, and he did get his head slammed in the door. There is some, it's nonfiction in those elements, but there is some fiction thrown in. For instance, Bootsy did sleep after this all happened, but it was more like 8 hours and not 24. It felt like 24, but it was more like 8. So this is how I'm outlining. This would be directly in my writer's notebook. I'm going to outline to tell this story. So I'd start with, maybe the idea that Bootsy's a cat gets his head slammed in the door. I'd go through details to lead us to the next point of he walks in circles. He can't stand up with his head up. He can't open his eyes at all whatsoever. He's dazed. He's confused. It looks bad. Eventually, he passes out and falls asleep, and he doesn't wake up for 24 hours straight. So I'm under the impression at this point he's going to die. He's not going to make it through, and he'll just eventually stop breathing. And then all of a sudden, when I least expect it, he wakes up. And then my resolution would be explaining the day-to-day aspects as he begins to get better and better and the way he starts getting better and better. So if I were going to tell this story, this narrative, I would have to go in chronological order from beginning, middle, all the way to the end. But again, notice how I'm probably going to spend more time in my paper filling this in, see how long this line is. And usually when we're writing stories and narratives, whether they're real or imaginary, this part of the narrative tends to take least amount of space in an essay. And you see that to be true in writers' works that are written professionally. And that's our next learning target we're going to go into. Please turn into your learning target packet to the reading section. Remember, the reading section are not graded when you turn in for me to grade your writing, because we're looking at other authors. In this case, we are going to look at a story called Rosanna. So get that story out at this time. We're going to do learning target number 1 to analyze the structure used by the author to organize the text. To analyze the structure of the author, we really have to break down. That's what analyze means, to break down. So you have to break this story down into its components and look closely at each of those components. So when we look at another author as the reader, we look at how the author uses those elements of plot in a beginning, middle, and end format. To analyze it, we pull those out of the author's story that we're reading and kind of arrange it in a visual way so that we can see how that author set up their piece. Remember, as writers, we need to set up our own plots. And now we're going to look at how an author did that by looking at their story. So we're going to go ahead and read that at this time. Okay, so now let's analyze this plot. Let's break it down into its smallest components, because this author probably started their piece by creating this diagram before they even wrote the story. A good author knows how their story approximately, you might change it here and there, but you have an idea of how that beginning, middle, and end, how that chronologically is going to play out before you even start writing it. So you want to start a narrative with this in your notebook. So in the exposition of Rosanna, we have this character, Rosanna, with a bully. That's their conflict. She has this guy who won't let her walk down that path in the meadow, which is our setting. She sees this film faker guy and has him make her a lie. That's part of our rising action. There's a lot of other details included. Most of the story is rising action until we get to the climax, where that brother does become a bully, and it's not beneficial to Rosanna anymore that her brother is big and tough. The falling action is that film faker allows her to figure out a new lie, but that this one, the twist is this one's going to be permanent. That's a big deal. It resolves at the end of this story. This author decides to resolve it by having Rosanna make up the lie that she's the strongest girl in the world, and picks up and moves the bully out of her way to keep going. So just as we've analyzed how this author set up their story, this is the first step of creating a narrative. A narrative can be fictional, it can be non-fictional, but you need to start with a map. You need to create your structure using these elements of having a beginning, a middle, and an end chronologically before you start writing a story. If you have not done that yet in your writing, I would recommend to go back and redo that. If your piece is sounding more like an informative piece, telling me about a sport or telling me about a trip you took, you really need to hone in on a conflict. In my case, the conflict is that this cat got its head slammed in a door. If your story has no conflict, it doesn't have a plot. Every aspect of plot has a conflict. So determine, maybe stop writing whatever you currently are and start something new that has a full conflict attached to it. Create your plot structure. This is the best guide for outlining and organizing a narrative. So at this time, as we've talked about, we focused in on looking at the story of Rosanna with learning target reading number 1. We analyzed how that author of this piece set up their story by breaking it down into its smallest parts. And then for your writing today, really look at your plot. Does it have a conflict? That's important for having a narrative. And does it showcase a chronological beginning, middle, and end using this structure? Set it up on a page before you begin that story. Go ahead and get writing.